They had tanks, they had speed, they had open desert, clear visibility, and no meaningful obstacles in front of them. By every established rule of modern warfare, the outcome of this advance was already decided before it even began. Armor moves forward, infantry yields, momentum carries everything with it. That is how these operations are expected to unfold. And yet, US Marines were baffled when Iraqi generals stopped an armored invasion without tanks or air superiority. This was not a desperate last stand. There was no massive counterattack, no sudden technological breakthrough, no dramatic explosion that explained everything in a single moment. The armored columns did not collapse. They did not get destroyed. They were not forced to retreat under fire. They simply stopped, and in the first minutes after it happened, no one watching could clearly explain why. Armored warfare is built on a promise that feels almost absolute. Once an armored force begins moving, it is meant to keep moving. Speed protects it. Mass sustains it. Momentum turns pressure into inevitability. Infantry without armor is not supposed to stop that momentum. At best, it delays. At worst, it is bypassed and left behind. Air power is expected to decide what armor alone cannot. Remove both, and resistance is supposed to dissolve. That assumption shaped every expectation going into this operation. It shaped planning timelines, intelligence estimates, and command confidence. It was not debated because it had been validated again and again. The terrain reinforced that belief. This was not a city, not mountains, not jungle. It was open desert, flat ground, long sight lines, minimal cover. The kind of environment armored doctrine was designed to dominate. There were no friendly tanks positioned to meet the advance, no controlling presence in the air. From a distance, the sector looked empty. From doctrine's perspective, it was an invitation to move forward. For the US Marines observing the situation, the expectation was straightforward. The armored force would push through, the timeline would accelerate, follow-on operations would adjust accordingly. This sector was not expected to decide anything meaningful. What they saw instead was hesitation. Columns slowed, spacing tightened, movement became cautious. That alone was unusual. Armored formations are trained to maintain tempo precisely to avoid this moment. At first, the slowdown was dismissed as friction. Every advance encounters resistance. Every plan meets delays. Armored units are designed to absorb that friction and continue. This delay did not resolve itself. It deepened. Reports began to conflict. Some units claimed contact. Others reported no visible enemy. Some reported movement ahead. Others reported uncertainty along their flanks. There were no large explosions, no decisive engagements, no single event that could be pointed to and explained. Just a growing sense that the advance was losing coherence. From the outside, nothing dramatic appeared to be happening. From the inside, momentum was quietly draining away. To understand why this mattered, it helps to understand what armored forces fear most. It is not infantry fire. It is not even losses. It is uncertainty. Armor depends on clarity, clear routes, clear threats, clear timing. When that clarity erodes, armor slows. And when armor slows, it becomes vulnerable. The Iraqi generals understood this reality with unusual precision. They knew they could not win a tank-on-tank fight. They knew they did not control the air. They knew that direct confrontation would end badly. So they chose a different objective. Their goal was not destruction. It was paralysis. Not to defeat the force, but to interrupt its logic. They did not try to hold ground in a conventional sense. Instead, they disrupted rhythm. Instead of massing forces, they fragmented perception. Instead of presenting a clear defensive line, they presented ambiguity. Small engagements appeared and disappeared. Threats were suggested, then withdrawn. Positions shifted just enough to suggest danger without confirming it. The armoured columns could not identify a single decisive enemy. Only the sense that something was always just ahead, just out of view, never fully confirmed. Doctrine assumes resistance reveals itself. This resistance did not. It forced commanders to slow down, reassess, and wait for confirmation that never fully arrived. Every pause compounded the problem. Fuel burned, spacing collapsed, command timelines slipped, orders were delayed, revised, and delayed again. Momentum, once lost, proved impossible to regain. From the Marine perspective, this was deeply puzzling. There was no enemy breakthrough to point to, no dramatic ambush footage, no clear moment when everything went wrong. There was only an armoured invasion that was no longer advancing. Without movement, the entire operational picture changed. Armoured warfare relies on initiative. Whoever dictates tempo dictates outcomes. The moment the tempo shifted, the advantage began to evaporate. The Iraqi generals had not defeated the force. They had trapped it in indecision. This is the part of warfare doctrine rarely discusses. Not how forces are destroyed, but how they are neutralized. By denying confidence, by denying clarity, by denying certainty. The invasion was still intact. The vehicles were still operational. The crews were still present and capable, but the invasion was no longer decisive. As the delay stretched on, consequences multiplied. Artillery windows opened, air coordination became possible, follow-on units adjusted posture. What should have been a rapid penetration became a fixed problem, and fixed forces are manageable forces. There was no single moment when someone declared the invasion stopped. No dramatic radio call, no official announcement. Instead, there was a quiet realization spreading through command channels. The advance was not resuming. For Iraqi commanders, this was success. Not because they had gained ground, but because they had denied it. They had achieved the impossible. They had stopped armour without armour. For US Marines observing the situation, the lesson was unsettling. Everything they expected to see was absent. No tanks, no air superiority, no decisive engagement, and yet the outcome was undeniable. Confusion replaced confidence. Not panic, not fear, but genuine bafflement. How does a force built for speed lose motion in perfect terrain? The answer was uncomfortable because it suggested that power alone is not enough, that doctrine can become a liability, and that the most dangerous assumption in war is believing the enemy must fight the way you expect. Once initiative was lost, recovery became nearly impossible. The operational window closed. External pressure increased. What followed was no longer an invasion. It was a managed withdrawal from opportunity. This event never became famous. There were no iconic images, no single dramatic moment to replay, but its implications were profound. It demonstrated that stopping power does not always require equal force. Sometimes it requires understanding what your opponent cannot afford to lose. In this case, it was momentum. Military doctrine quietly absorbed the lesson. Movement can be denied without destruction. Armour can be neutralized without armour. Certainty can be turned against itself. The Marines were not defeated, but they were forced to reconsider something fundamental. That inevitability in war is often an illusion. The desert did not favour the strongest, it favoured the most adaptive. And on that axis, adaptation mattered more than hardware. This was not a victory celebrated, it was a realisation endured. One side learned that doctrine is not destiny, The other learned that impossibility is contextual. Since then, militaries have studied this pattern quietly, not because it was dramatic, but because it was repeatable. Control of movement is control of outcomes, and movement begins in the mind, not the machine. That day in the desert, tanks did not fail mechanically. They failed conceptually. The invasion stopped not because it was destroyed, but because it no longer made sense to continue. That is what baffled the Marines most. There was no enemy to point at, only a result that contradicted everything they expected. War is full of lessons learned loudly. This was one learned quietly. So the question remains, what other military certainties exist only because they have not yet been challenged? And how many future invasions will stop, not with explosions, but with doubt?